The Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Emecheta. I'll be speaking about motherhood, patriarchy, colonialism, and the cost of sacrifice. What if I told you that The Joys of Motherhood is not really a book about the joys of motherhood, or at least not only about motherhood? Buchi Emecheta's 1979 novel follows Nnu Ego, who is an Igbo woman living through a period of enormous social and economic change in Nigeria. On the surface, this is a story about a woman who desperately wants children, sacrifices almost everything for them, and eventually dies alone. But underneath that story are much bigger questions. What happens when a woman's entire identity is built around motherhood? What happens when motherhood is supposed to provide security, but raising children actually creates more economic hardship? What happens when traditional expectations about gender collide with colonialism, capitalism, urbanization, and changing ideas about family? And perhaps most importantly, how much responsibility should we place on Nnu Ego for the life she leads, and how much responsibility belongs to society around her? Today, we are going to explore the joys of motherhood through these questions. I want to make something very clear from the beginning. I'm not here to tell you exactly what Buchi Emecheta wanted you to think. I'm going to give you historical context, examine the major characters and themes, and discuss different interpretations, and let you decide what this whole novel is entirely or ultimately saying. The joys of motherhood. What does motherhood really cost? Before we begin or delve into this, I want to really speak about who was Buchi Emecheta. Before we talk about Nnu Ego, we need to briefly understand the woman who created that character. So Buchi Emecheta was a Nigerian-born British writer whose work frequently explored women's lives, motherhood, marriage, education, migration, gender inequality, and the tensions between African traditions and changing social structures. And this matters because Emecheta wasn't just writing about these issues from a purely theoretical perspective. Her writing mostly asks what happens to women when the expectations placed around them are so enormous, but their economic and social power is limited. The Joys of Motherhood was published in 1979. This novel was set primarily in colonial Nigeria, especially Lagos, and follows Nnu Ego across different stages of her life. So this isn't contemporary Nigeria. This is Nigeria under the British colonial rule. And that historical context is extremely important because the society Nnu Ego inhabits isn't static. She is in a society where it is constantly changing and evolving. People are moving, cities are growing each and every single day. Wage labor is becoming very important. Money is also very central to survival. And then Western education is also valuable in this society. Traditional structures are being placed under new pressures. So when we look at Nnu Ego's struggles, we have to ask ourselves, are these problems caused by traditional gender expectations? Are these caused by colonial economic structures? Or are these caused by poverty? You could also ask, are these produced by the interaction of all three? That's one of the most interesting reasons this novel is so much captivating. Nnu Ego is an Igbo woman, as already mentioned, whose understanding of herself is deeply connected to motherhood. And that's important because in the world she inhabits, children or having children isn't simply about personal fulfillment. Children can have social, economic, and familiar significance, which means that motherhood can influence a woman's status in that environment. Are you following? Children, therefore, can represent continuity, and sons in particular can be extremely important because of expectations around family lineage and support. It doesn't necessarily enter motherhood thinking, I'm going to have children because I personally want to experience motherhood. Her understanding is so much broader because it has also been influenced by societal expectations. Motherhood is part of what she has been taught a successful woman should be. And this creates a very important distinction. Nnu Ego has personal desires, but she also has societal expectations placed upon her. And sometimes these two don't necessarily align perfectly. Her early experiences with motherhood are already painful, and I will explain why. She experiences loss. In fact, her first male child, died. She experiences maternal difficulties and marital difficulties, and eventually she moves to Lagos. This movement is very significant because Lagos represents a very different environment from the rural community in which Nnu Ego was raised. In Lagos, survival requires money. You can't just depend on community and society. And Nnu Ego's ability to provide for her family becomes connected to the economic realities of urban life. She has to sell, she has to work. Goals to maintain this work and family balance, and then she also stretches whatever resources she has, and her children become the source of her motivation and the source of enormous responsibility. You understand where I'm going with this when you continue watching this video, because if motherhood is supposed to be a woman's greatest joy, why does it require so much responsibility? I think you may be wondering, why is the book then called The Joys of Motherhood? The title for me is one of the most important literary devices in the novel, because there is an obvious tension between the phrase the joys of motherhood and much of what we actually witness in the novel. Nnu Ego actually experiences love. She experiences moments of pride. She experiences fulfillment through her children, not all of them, but she also experiences grief, and it's a major part of her story. Poverty, very much of it. She experiences exhaustion, frustration, and eventually loneliness. So the title can be read ironically, and that's what I see. But irony doesn't necessarily mean that motherhood or Emecheta is saying motherhood is bad. That's too simplistic in my understanding. She may instead be questioning the social ideal form of motherhood. In other words, maybe the problem is in motherhood itself. Maybe the problem is that the expectation that motherhood should be a woman's primary source of identity, purpose, status, and security. And this distinction matters, because a woman can genuinely love being a mother while also questioning the societal expectations surrounding motherhood. These aren't necessarily contradictory positions, and Nnu Ego embodies that contradiction. She loves her children, in fact she adores them, but motherhood is costing her. One of the most powerful themes in this novel is sacrifice. Nnu Ego sacrifices almost constantly. She sacrifices financially, she sacrifices emotionally, she even sacrifices opportunities, and she repeatedly puts the needs of her children before her own. And this isn't the first time we've heard of this, but we need to ask this: why? Why does she naturally and intentionally do this? Because Nnu Ego isn't necessarily making random sacrifices. She has been taught that a good mother sacrifices, and this creates a very interesting cycle, because society highlights and pinpoints this to her. Your children are your future. Your children give you status in the society. Your children will justify your sacrifices. So what does Nnu Ego eventually do? She invests everything she has into her children, and then she expects something in return. And this not necessarily in a very selfish way, because if I sacrifice for my children will eventually sacrifice. Do you get what I'm trying to get at? And this is where the novel becomes very heartbreaking, because the world changes, her children their own lives. Education now creates new possibilities. Migration creates distance, and Nnu Ego's expectation that her children will ultimately become the security she sacrificed for becomes unstable. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens when the social contract Nnu Ego was taught to believe in no longer works? At this point, we're going to reach one of the most important questions in the novel. Was Nnu Ego responsible for her own suffering? There are different ways we should approach this and answer this. One interpretation emphasizes patriarchy. From this perspective, Nnu Ego lives within a system where a woman's value is strongly connected to marriage, fertility, and motherhood. And you can't really blame her for that. Another interpretation emphasizes economics. Nnu Ego's choices are restrained by poverty. It's difficult to talk about personal freedom when somebody is constantly worrying about food, rent, clothing, education, and survival. Another interpretation emphasizes colonialism. The society around Nnu Ego is undergoing profound economic transformation. Traditional structures are being disrupted. Wage labor becomes very important. Urban life creates new forms of dependency. And another interpretation combines all of these. Maybe Nnu Ego's situation isn't caused by just one structure. Maybe it's the intersection of gender, class, economics, colonialism, and family expectations. And this is why I think we shouldn't just describe her as a victim, because she does make choices. She has beliefs. She has opinions. She sometimes makes decisions that affect other people. She participates in some of the structures that constrain her. That's actually what makes her character very interesting. She has agency, but her agency operates within a certain limit and boundary. Having choices doesn't necessarily mean having unlimited choices, if that makes sense. And this brings us to one of my favorite comparisons in the novel. I really enjoyed reading this part. Nnu Ego and Adaku. Because if Emecheta wanted us to believe that all women simply accept their circumstances, why give us Adaku? Adaku is Nnu Ego's co-wife, and she responds to the same social structure around her very differently. She recognizes that relying entirely on the traditional system may not provide her with the security she needs. So what does she do? She begins to pursue greater economic independence, and she also thinks differently about her daughters, which I found that part to be very interesting. This part really created a very fascinating contrast for me, because Nnu Ego invests very heavily in the traditional idea that children, and particularly sons, will provide security and status. Adaku, on the other hand, is so willing to challenge that arrangement. And now we have two women, similar society, different responses, and that complicates our interpretation. Because if Nnu Ego's situation were completely predetermined, why does Adaku behave differently? Someone tell me. Leave it in the comment section. Why does she behave differently? Because would you say maybe Adaku had different circumstances, or maybe she had different personality, or even maybe she sees possibilities Nnu Ego doesn't? Maybe the social system itself allows for more negotiation than we initially think, and perhaps Emecheta is showing us that women can resist oppressive structures in different ways. And most importantly, the novel doesn't necessarily tell us that Adaku is simply better. She has her own difficulties. So the comparison isn't Nnu Ego is bad, Adaku is good. It's more interesting than that. It's here are two women negotiating the same changing world differently. What do we learn from that then? Another uncomfortable aspect of this novel is a different value assigned to sons and daughters. I know you really want me to talk about that, because Nnu Ego wants her sons to succeed. In fact, she invests so much into them, and this makes sense within the social world she inhabits. Sons can be associated with family, continuity, lineage, and future support. Daughters, on the other hand, are often expected to marry and become part of another household. So if resources are limited, investing into a son can be understood as investing into the future of one's own family. Here is a contradiction then. Nnu Ego is herself restrained or constrained by a system that values men differently from women, And yes, she sometimes reproduces that same value